All right, thank you for coming in this evening. Glad that you're with us and joining us for this conversation. And also want to just say a greeting to those of you here joining us online. We appreciate you dialing in and being a part of this as well. My name is Ben Dockery. I'm the executive director of the Lakelight Institute, and this is one of the initiatives that we do to try to spur one another on toward wisdom. We're looking for timeless wisdom in our modern world. And so these talks, we're looking to leading thinkers to help us consider issues that we need to do tonight. As you know, our guest is Collin Hansen, who has done a number of things. He'll be focusing tonight on his book, Timothy Keller, and this is about his intellectual and his spiritual formation primarily. Before I tell you a little bit about this, though Collin and I have been friends or colleagues for, quite a while, maybe 10 years or so. But you may know him from a couple different things. He's an author. He has written in national publications regularly. He is the chief content editor for the Gospel Coalition. If you're not familiar with the Gospel Coalition, I'll give you some brief stats to let you know sort of what team he is managing if he's the content editor for that. So I looked this up and want to make sure I get some of these things right. Last year, they had 28 million unique viewers, or like 77 million views or something like that. Which, because my kids are in math stage right now, we broke this down. It's about 2.5 views per second, all day, every day of the year. So there you go. There's a lot of people that are reading different TGC articles. They had 11 million podcast downloads last year as well, so that's another broad audience that they're looking at. Published about a dozen books plus. There are 17 international Gospel Coalition sites, so there's another 17 million plus views on their international sites. So they have not just a national reach, but a global reach as well, and are doing lots of interesting translation work. We were talking beforehand about one of the new language translation that this book is moving into right away, and Collin will be traveling to go speak about Dr. Keller abroad as well. So in addition to that, adjunct faculty member at Beeson Divinity School down in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where Collin calls home and raises his 3 kids down there. He is going to be talking to us about this book, which is a unique book in the category. It's hard to sort of categorize it. You want to call it a biography, but that's really not what it is. It's looking at ways in which Tim Keller himself has been influenced. So we kind of get to go to school by reading this book the same way that Tim Keller went to school. What were his influences? Who talked to him? What was he reading? Who was he talking with? Who was he dialoguing with? How did that shape him as an individual? And so that was the task that Collin had in putting this out. And so without further ado, I'm going to let him tell you more about that and some things that he learned in the process. So please join me in welcoming Collin Hansen.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be with you. You might be confused by me saying that it's kind of like coming home, but I've lived in Birmingham, Alabama since 2012, but I did go to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and before that I was the news editor at Christianity Today magazine. Before that I was an undergrad at Northwestern, and I'm from South Dakota originally. So being back in the Midwest is very much like home, and Chicago specifically. It was years where my wife and I met and where we spent our first decade of our life together. And so we have many living out in the Wheaton, Carroll Stream area. So it's wonderful to be able to be here. And oh my goodness, the weather is so much better here than it is in Alabama today. So praise the Lord. Praise the Lord for that. It is my privilege to be able to talk about somebody who mentored and helped me in innumerable ways, and hopefully he's done that for you in many of the same ways that he did for me through his books and through his sermons, that thankfully, even though we've lost him earlier this year, and we were just in New York City for the memorial service a couple weeks ago, but that he continues to speak from us as he guides us into biblical truth that remains relevant not only for this time, but for many years to come, I trust. It is a little bit awkward sometimes talking about Tim because he is not the kind of person who ever would have written an autobiography. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's just not his personality. It was hard enough for me to be able to convince him to do this book on his spiritual and intellectual formation. He just didn't like to talk about himself, but he loved to talk about what he was learning. It was always the topic of conversation with him, and he was always learning. It's one of the best things that I've learned from him. The closest Tim Keller came to writing an autobiography is his 2008 book, The Prodigal God, one of the first two and one of his best-selling works. On the cover of the program from his memorial this month, you'll see his friend Mako Fujimura, the visual artist, and the painting there that Mako did for him is Prodigal God. You'll see it there. You can see how important that was to Tim. Now you may have heard this or read this in his book, his interpretation of Jesus' famous parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. But what Tim helps us to see, guided in part by his mentor Ed Clowney, is that we are not just talking about one son in this parable, but we are talking about two. Both of the sons are lost, even though one of them stayed home. And that older brother represents in Jesus' talk here the Pharisees who protest the lavish grace of the Father. Now, Tim talked about this, of how sometimes churches will attract younger or older brother types in the same congregation. He used to say that younger brothers in places like where I live in Alabama will move to New York to escape their older brothers. And that many younger brothers had wandered into the doors of Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which he started in 1989. But Tim, I think, may have understood this story so well because he represented both brothers. He was the oldest of three children. One of them is surviving, his sister. And his mother expected a lot of him. He was the only one that was allowed to attend a private university. The other two were told they could only attend state schools. He was definitely going to be the one who would make the family most proud. His family actually nicknamed him Boy Scout. In fact, he was an Eagle Scout growing up, but the way his wife Kathy talked to me, they would always give him a hard time. He always wanted to do the right thing. And she always say he wouldn't even park by a fire hydrant. Like, that's how much he just wanted to do the right thing. But I think before my book, and really myself, before I studied this, not many people knew that Tim was also that younger brother. And part of the process of me writing this book, I remember where I was in Alabama, and I said, I need to just listen to the soundtrack of 1968. And the most popular song in America in 1968, which is when Tim started undergraduate in college at Bucknell, was Hey Jude. Of course, you can only begin to talk about all the other things that we know happened, the assassinations, the turmoil of 1968. But Tim had rebelled. He rebelled against his family, rebelled against his church, and especially what they taught about religion, race, and sex. He studied other world religions. He studied in his classes existentialism from the likes of Albert Camus. This is the time of the death of God. Time magazine was asking, is God dead? Well, because of his experiences in his family and his church, Tim was pretty sure that he did not want to be a Christian. But it was also Christians, these body of believers at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at Bucknell University, who helped lead him to born-again faith in Jesus. And this is what he wrote in The Prodigal God, quote, "There is no way you will be able to grow spiritually apart from a deep involvement in a community of other believers. You can't live the Christian life without a band of Christian friends, without a family of believers in which you find a place." So my book aims to introduce you to Keller's community, to his friends, his family, his mentors, but also authors who encouraged and challenged him and taught him even across the centuries. And the way I organize the book is to think of Keller like a tree. And the book is sort of cuts open his life and ministry so that we can explore all the different rings inside that tree. And I can say, after 20 some years now of ministry, I have never seen a more mature tree, a more solid oak with so many discernible rings of growth and maturation over those years. One of the most common responses that I will often receive from people is they say, I bought your book, but your book made me buy a dozen more books. I think that probably would be the most pleasing response Tim could ever imagine. And I think it was one of the major reasons that we did this. I know it was one of the major reasons we did this book together. There are all sorts of different figures who, just through time and through trends, become lost to many of us in history, and yet still have so much to teach us through their writings and otherwise. And Tim just never thought of himself as the destination. He's sort of like our guide along the journey of discovering, built off a lifelong curiosity. So he'd grab over here from John Stott's preaching, or from Herman Bavinck's worldview over there, or he'd grab the new urbanism that he would read about cities from Jane Jacobs, or existentialist philosophy from Søren Kierkegaard. And long before he had ever even become moderately famous, his rings also grew to include Jack Miller, R.C. Sproul, Elizabeth Elliot, lesser known people like Barbara Boyd or Richard Lovelace or Harvey Kahn, not to mention even completely unknown pastors like Kennedy Smart, who gave him his first job out of seminary. Sometimes you'll see in younger leaders, maybe you see this in your own life, a tendency toward following the fads. It's like fashion. One year, blue is the new black, and then black is the new black, and it gets really confusing, especially as you get older. Everyone's reading this guy, but now that guy over here has been canceled. That's just not the way it worked for Keller. He opted for synthesis over antithesis. How do you bring these things together? So when he was adding his rings, he was not subtracting others. Always growing in that sense. His core, there's another way that this concept really comes together, because his core never changed since his conversion in 1970. That core was the gospel of Jesus Christ, this unmerited favor that we call grace. If you'd met him in college, he would have wanted to talk to you about justification by faith alone. And if you would have met him or talked with him in his hospital room as he died this year, he would have wanted to talk to you about the same thing. Younger students that he mentored back in Bucknell, it was really fascinating for me to talk to them. They would still talk to him as a kind of mentor figure to them, even though they were themselves 70 by that point. They continued to look to him that way. They recognized him. His classmates from Gordon Conwell recognized his teaching style. One of his best friends, Louise Midwood, told me it was the most uncommon experience. We'd go in class together and lecture, and then all of us would go back to Tim's dorm room afterward. He would redo the entire lecture, only this time it made so much more sense with his sort of special twist in it. I think any of us who have read his books or listened to him could recognize the same thing of how clear he could make complex ideas for us. His church members from Hopewell, Virginia, right out of seminary, recognized his zeal for revival, and early Redeemer members remembered his same emphasis on community. In fact, I think that one of the reasons Tim Keller's contributions have been, I think even maybe until very recently, have been underestimated is precisely because he was so consistent. His theology, his relationships, his personality, all of them very stable. And also he was quick to credit others, to credit those influences. So people would think that he wasn't very original, that they weren't really learning anything new there. Rarely could you find an idea in Keller that you couldn't track down to somewhere else, which is why if you truly want to understand him, you need to be reading his footnotes. Follow those footnotes, often longer explanations of where he got those ideas, shows his processing and working with sources. And that's where you can also see his originality, which is in that synthesis, where he would pull together sources that proved to be unexpectedly helpful across disciplines. C.S. Lewis was certainly one of his major influences. Mako Fujimura told me that whenever Tim Keller did not have time to prepare his message, they could always tell. because he would just quote C.S. Lewis. He said, and none of us minded because it was so great. We just loved it so much. But instead, you didn't just get somebody regurgitating C.S. Lewis. You got somebody pulling from 100 different sources, from the New York Times bestseller list all the way to Puritan classics. And I think that's one of the best ways that we can remember him as our guide to the gurus, who always added his unique twist. But I think if Tim Keller, before he went to New York City, was a seminary professor in Philadelphia. And I think if he had remained that seminary professor, had never gone to New York City at age 39, that we probably still would probably know who he was. He was that gifted. I talked with one of the other faculty members at Westminster in those times, and he said, none of us had a chance. So the students would always start out in our little faculty mentor groups, and they would always gravitate toward Tim. It was like we could understand. They would gravitate, and this is long before he's famous at all. They would gravitate toward him. So probably we would still know who he was. But I think we're especially blessed because he got to implement his learning as a practitioner, as a builder of institutions. And he instilled his vision through all kinds of different organizations, including where I've worked since 2010, the Gospel Coalition. But you can see this most accurately in Redeemer Presbyterian Church, still today in New York City. You can see the combination of small groups with vocational training, with evangelistic preaching, with a heavy emphasis on mercy ministry. A church that aimed to be intellectual but also pious at the same time, to be reformed but not at all sectarian. And I think that's how he left behind such a significant legacy. Just consider, for example, his work with church planting through Redeemer City to City. Among his generation, there's nobody who did as much as Tim Keller to prepare evangelicals for a global, multicultural, and urban future. It's pretty much impossible for us to think of him apart from New York City. Maybe the closest parallel in a previous generation would be John Stott in London. But I think there's a hidden lesson that I want all of us to be sure to internalize today in his contribution to urban church planting. And it's this: for the first half of his life, Keller showed almost no familiarity whatsoever with global, multicultural, or urban ministry. You find almost none of it in the first half of his life. For that matter, he didn't even release his first major book until 2008 when he was 57 years old. By contrast, it's the same year I released my first book over at Trinity when I was a student there. I would just say one of the things I take away from this is even if you're mid-career, even if you've been working in the same job for a couple decades even, you don't know what the Lord might be preparing you to do. You don't know how all of your different experiences and insights and studies might all cohere. So I think one thing we can learn from Tim is, in his example, is how to patiently build out the rings on our tree while we wait for a future that only the Lord can see. In the remaining 10 minutes or so that I have before Ben and I will be able to talk further, more in depth, is just to run through five more things that I learned in writing about Tim Keller. And one of the things I should just say, I wrote about this for Christianity Today magazine, but I had this moment of panic. It's a moment of panic at the beginning of writing this process. You could talk to my wife and kind of the harrowing conversations that we had. I thought, I've known Tim. We've edited books together. We've been in conferences around the world together. We've worked together at the Gospel Coalition for more than a decade. But I thought, how well do I really know him? Because of course, what's the old adage? Never get to know your heroes. You don't know what skeletons are inside that closet. Not to mention what's going to happen. I mean, what would it feel like for me if somebody said, okay, let's interview all of your closest friends and family members to talk about your childhood, talk about your relationship with your mother, talk about your awkward teenage years, talk about your parenting choices. I tell you, that's the part that didn't get in the book. Left that part out. It wasn't really the focus of the book, just some funny stories there. Anyway, but one of the things, he invited me to speak with all of these friends and family, and even vouched for me. but I didn't know what they would say. This year we launched the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, which I lead, and we'd seen a number of high-profile examples of pastors over the years, including apologists even quite recently, of just major scandals of harm that they've caused around the world. So sometimes it feels easier to sort of keep folks like this at a distance because you just don't know what skeletons are in that closet. But I think it was maybe the second interview that I did with his assistant, Craig Ellis, where I realized that the people around Tim were the least likely people to idolize him. And I don't mean because they didn't love him, they did, but it was more people at a distance that were likely to do that, but not the people closest to him. They knew a lot about his strengths and weaknesses as a manager, as a father, and as a friend. But it had that understanding had the opposite effect that you might expect. You might think, well, then they would have thought less of him because they got to see the real him. No, it was actually the opposite. They thought more of him because they knew the real version of him. They knew how he depended on God's grace, how he didn't boast. I think just consider his memorial service. There was not a picture of him to be found anywhere, not a grave to visit or to venerate. He wanted a sermon that was all about the gospel, it was all about Jesus, and that's what Sam Alberry gave us. There were all kinds of famous people. You could see him everywhere there, 2,000 people at St. Patrick's Cathedral. But all we got were a few words from his wife, Kathy, and his best friends from Hopewell, Virginia, and Roosevelt Island. And I think one of the major things that I took away was simply the best leaders, no matter your sphere of work, your family, your public career, whatever, the best leaders don't aim for perfection. They lead the way in repentance. You're going to mess up. It wasn't his many accomplishments that impressed his friends. It was instead his humility. It was his depth of character. So let me run through, just as that framing, just run through these 5 further things that I learned writing about Tim Keller. The first is, do not judge potential in young leaders too quickly. Do not judge potential in young leaders too quickly. You would never have identified Tim Keller as most likely to succeed in his seminary class. He wasn't the most outspoken student. He was very hurt by this, but none of his professors recognized him with any awards. He got a C in his preaching class. A C in his preaching class. There were no mentors who lined up to take him under their wing. And after seminary, Tim and Kathy didn't know where they would find any ministry job, so they took the civil service exam to join the U.S. Postal Service as mail carriers. So I talked with Tim's best man, and he gave me some insight that I think only the best man at your wedding is allowed to share with you. He said, well, Collin, I'm telling you, I understand. They must have been desperate. And I said, well, sure they were. I mean, Tim and Kathy were prepared to go out there and deliver mail. I mean, yeah, they were desperate. He said, Collin, that's not what I meant. I meant the church must have been desperate. The church must have been desperate that ultimately called them to a 3-month position in Hopewell, Virginia. He's like, Tim and Kathy were not impressive. They were not impressive people. Ministry is a long game, at least until Jesus returns. So don't give up on the leaders if they don't make that great first impression. This is a man who, between the ages of 57 and 71, released an entire library full of evangelical classics. We've got to resist that urge to think from fashion that younger is always better. Second, you can borrow from sources without buying everything they sell. You can borrow from sources without buying everything they sell. Tim was ordained in the Presbyterian Church in America, one of the most conservative, stalwart denominations in the United States. He was a conventional Reformed evangelical who taught the inerrancy of Scripture, penal substitutionary atonement of Jesus, justification by faith alone. Now, I know for a fact that he disagreed strongly with the British scholar N.T. Wright about the Reformation and Martin Luther. But Tim would be the first person to recommend Wright's landmark work on the resurrection of Jesus. A similar thing happened with Lesslie Newbigin. Tim did not always arrive at the same conclusions as this 20th century missiologist, but he would build on Newbegin's work, grabbing what he could to be able to set an agenda for Western Christians in the 21st century. You don't have to agree with everything to learn something from anyone. You don't have to agree with everything to learn something from anyone. It's very refreshing in our day and age that Tim was not a tribal thinker. I think you can attribute the breadth of his influence in part to his seeing the best in others. And the best in others. He could disagree with you without dismissing all of your work. He could quote you without endorsing you. He could encourage you, especially younger leaders, without making you conform to him. In fact, one of the things he most commonly said is that if we want to reach any city with the gospel for the sake of Jesus Christ, it will never just be your kind of church. There will always need to be a lot of different kinds of churches to reach that whole city. You can see how he would learn with others without having to agree with them on everything. Third, admit your weaknesses and ask for help. Twice in his leadership at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, Tim Keller needed to admit that he had a problem. The church's growth and complexity simply outgrew his managerial skill. And there wasn't even his prodigious work ethic that could save him. One of Tim's besetting sins was overwork. He typically was at about 100 hours a week for his work. So twice he called on friends to come serve as his executive pastor and to lead a restless and upset staff. Now, this is one of the areas where Tim and I disagreed. He insisted that he was not a good leader. I responded, "You're just not a good administrator." It's an important part of leadership, but it's not the only part of leadership. Just because you're gifted in preaching doesn't mean you're gifted in administration. But in the body of Christ, every part has its place, has its role. The mouth is not more important than the hands, we see in 1 Corinthians. And the best leaders know how to let go and empower others to fulfill their God-given roles. I recently read a biography of a Christian leader, and there was no mention of anything he had ever done wrong. I don't know about you, but that is very discouraging to me. That's definitely not my story as a leader or as a Christian. I think one thing Keller did was instill confidence in his followers because he didn't ask them for ultimate loyalty to himself, but to the same Christ that he followed. Fourth, we got a couple minutes here. Never stop learning. This one is probably obvious by now. I am not sure anyone ever extracted more from his seminary experience than Tim Keller did. You can read all about it in my book. In fact, this was inspiring to me. I was just talking with Mike about this on his podcast, but actually brought along to me on the trip today a book written by one of my undergraduate professors. Just that challenge to always continue to learn, always continuing to grow. It's a major inspiration for me. Most leaders would be content with even that foundation of learning that he got all the way going back to his master's education, but not Keller. I think one of the key insights of my book is what happened after he published his best-selling apologetics book. You hit the New York Times bestseller list with this major work of apologetics, and you're already privately acknowledging, which he's now publicly acknowledged, that by the time the book was published, you already thought it was obsolete. You thought it had already been surpassed. There was actually a moment in the interviews where Tim's assistant said to me, "Collin, you know there's no chapter on sexuality in that book." I said, that's not possible. There had to be a chapter on sexuality in that book. 2008. I said, go ahead and look, it's not there. He was right. I was wrong, it's not there. That book was already obsolete in his view. Again, you can still profit from it today. It's a wonderful book. But he was already rethinking his apologetic method in light of new reading from some peers who drove him deeper. And that became his 2016 book, Making Sense of God. The best teachers never stop learning. Same with the best leaders. Tim Keller could have coasted, but we're glad that he did. Last point, keep pressing for a deeper experience of God. When I worked on this book, Keller didn't know if he had 1 day to live or 10 more years to write books and mentor the rising generation of Christian leaders. That's life with pancreatic cancer. But of course, we're all in the same position. None of us knows what tomorrow holds either. But in the months after his diagnosis in 2020, I noticed a change in Tim. You can actually listen to the interview that I did with him on the podcast, Life and Books and Everything, if you want to hear it. I think you can audibly hear him sound lighter. He's just been told, it's 2021, but he's just been told that he's going to die of pancreatic cancer. He's not going to see his grandchildren grow up. I mean, all these sort of things, but he seems lighter, like a burden had been lifted. And he could focus on today, not on tomorrow's trouble. He redoubled his efforts in prayer in search of a deeper communion with God. And he said something that many people have observed since that interview and in my book. He said, "I'm not fighting cancer. I'm fighting my sin." That just characterized kind of his orientation toward his experience with God. So you can see how his tree never stopped growing, never stopped adding rings. I don't know how you and I would respond if we were told that we had months to live, but Tim kept talking about the books he was reading. I could just imagine the conversations he must be having now with Jesus and others in heaven. But shortly before he died, in conclusion here, all 24 fellows who have gathered together for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics at the Gospel Coalition, we gathered together in New York. And Tim was getting treatment down in Bethesda. He was just about to leave and come back home. And he gave us an hour on Zoom, despite his declining health. It was actually hard for us to see him in that condition. It was really very difficult. And we wanted him to stay and continue guiding us in how to respond with the gospel in our changing world. But he told us, "You guys will be fine to do it without me." And he left us with that charge. In part, I think it's because even though many of us saw Tim as our hero, he ultimately saw only Jesus as a truly worthy hero. And in this book, he points us to so many of his heroes who have also gone before us and are gone, and yet the gospel remains. The Holy Spirit remains to guide us in our generation to do what we must in our day. The day before Tim died, he told his family, "I'm thankful for the time God has given me, but I'm ready to see Jesus. Send me home." So I think the final thing we can learn from him is to prepare for eternity, whether it's now or decades from now. None of us knows the length of our days. Soon we'll see God face to face. And now, as Tim's faith is sight, so also we will one day behold Jesus more glorious than we can ever imagine. Thank you. Well.
All right, we are going to shift to a time of Q&A here and ask some questions. And before we do that, my first question is actually for the audience here. I am curious, raise your hand if you have listened to a sermon by Tim Keller, read a book by Tim Keller, or at least have a book that somebody gave you to read about Tim Keller. You get credit for all three. Yeah, most of the room who are in here. His influence, as you know, is massive, and it will be interesting to see kind of what history tells when a true biography one day is written on that side of things. So we're going to ask questions, go back and forth a little bit here, and I'm going to do this, and I haven't told Collin kind of what's coming his way yet. So
you've been talking to me all afternoon about what we're doing, and now you're throwing me a curveball.
No, I'm not throwing a curveball. I'm going to do it in three ways. So we're going to focus on the personal life biography first, and then discipleship church stuff, and then legacy last. Perfect. That's how I formulated it after the way you did it. So tell us more about Hopewell. It's one of the chapters people don't know a lot about. He was there for how long? Did he preach regularly? What did he do there? And how did that season form him? Because there's a lot of people that might be in a season in their life where they're not Tim Keller up here, but they're Tim Keller somewhere else. So tell us more about that Hopewell season.
Hopewell, Virginia is near Petersburg, Virginia, south of Richmond. I'm kind of a Civil War buff, so I wrote in the book about all the different significant things. It was General Grant's headquarters there at the end of that final campaign that ended at Appomattox in 1865. So Hopewell, Virginia, this was one of the major challenges for Tim. He ended up being invited down there for a 3-month trial run, but Tim and Kathy are both Yankees. They had no experience in the South, but they had joined the Presbyterian Church in America largely through R.C. Sproul's recommendation. He also conducted their wedding. So that's why they went down there, and it was a culture shock. Again, if you know anything about Tim, you know how we've been seeing here how intellectual, how sort of socially awkward he could be. And now all of a sudden you're in a congregation where only 2 of the members have attended college. Both of them are elementary school teachers. A number of them have fathers who fought in the Civil War on the southern side. It's a very different setting all of a sudden. And that was kind of the first exposure he had to what became one of his genius contributions, was the ability to understand cultural dynamics, and precisely because he was such a fish out of water. But he preached 1,500 sermons there. He was there for almost a decade. All 3 of the Keller's sons were born there. And it became the place for one of his most important teaching, one of his most important lessons for leadership, was that you have to understand sort of the currency of trust in your context. In Hopewell, Virginia, the currency of trust was people have to know that you care about them, that you love them, that you'll show up physically, tangibly for them before they'll ever listen to anything you say. In New York City, people are not interested in you giving them that tangible help. They need to know that you're smart and credible and accomplished before they'll listen to you there. So the fact that he was able to be so successful as a small Presbyterian church that enjoyed some pretty strong growth during those years that he was there, that he could enjoy that kind of success by God's grace, just shows some of that versatility. And I think there wasn't really a lot out there about Hopewell before my book, but it was just a fascinating time of their lives. And I think for people in ministry in particular, it's often been their favorite chapter because it shows you Tim as the everyday pastor more than anything else in the book.
Yeah, it certainly does. And so before he goes to New York City, before he plants Redeemer at the end of the 1980s, he has another season. But tell us about that choice, because he wasn't saying, I'm going to go plant a church in New York City, that's where I'm going to go. Was that an easy step of faith for the Kellers in general? Tell us a little bit more about that decision to actually go to New York.
Yeah, so Tim was not interested in that. So was not interested in going to New York, in part because they were so happy in Philadelphia. Given his personality profile that I'm sharing tonight, you can see he felt more natural as a professor. And I think people could understand that. Also, this was 1980s New York. You have a juxtaposition of sort of the David Wilkerson crossing the switchblade, sort of rough and tumble New York, combined with high finance, early explosion of Wall Street, New York. And one of their the Keller's best friends, also from Jack Miller's influence in Philadelphia, were Dick and Liz Kaufman. Dick and Liz Kaufman had both gone to Harvard Business School. They had both planned out every month of their lives into their 70s. They were just really bold, bold, power, spirit-led evangelists, street preaching and things like that. And everybody thought the Kaufmans, that's the kind of people who need to go. Tim is way too intellectual for New York. And plus Kathy, she doesn't want to raise these 3 boys in there. But it became one of the most interesting relational dynamics in there, because Tim came home one day and said to Kathy, I've decided to tell them I'm not going to go. Kathy says, well, why? Why are you telling them you're not going to go? Well, because I just don't think it'd probably be good for you, and you probably don't want to go. And Kathy sort of slams down and says, be the man. You make that decision. It's up to you to make that decision. If I've got a problem with that, I'll take it up with the Lord, which she then did over communion there in Philadelphia at their Presbyterian
So that's a perfect
church.
segue. that's a perfect segue to this, because the biggest influence in Tim Keller's life, if you have a chance to read this or you've heard this before, the biggest influence, who's influenced his spiritual life, his intellectual life the most, survey says...
Yeah, that's Kathy Keller.
Kathy Keller.
And at some level, that's always going to be the case. I mean, who among us would not say if we're blessed to be married that our spouse wouldn't be that biggest influence? But especially ministry marriages can run a wide spectrum. Tim and Kathy were very much on the shared ministry end of the spectrum. This, of course, is owing in part to the fact that they were friends, like very close friends, at Gordon Conwell as students. It also owed to the fact that Tim became a Christian later in college, Kathy, especially through the ministry of Young Life, as a high school student. And Kathy was precocious. Another one of the things, I was really insistent in the book on having some good pictures in the middle. One of my favorites, Kathy just sent me a picture of one of the letters that C.S. Lewis had sent her. And it just sort of, you just toss out there, well, you know, Kathy Christie as a child in 1963, 12 or 13 years old, is one of the last people to ever correspond with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I mean,
and then it gets better from there. Kathy is so, I mean, she talks about this in Christianity Today and some other places, but she had no idea that Lewis was famous. She thought she was corresponding as a child, as a preteen, with this British author who had largely failed in his career, and she was bolstering his spirits.
Yeah, of course.
and then he dies, and who thinks, I'm gonna go visit his house at 15 years old? That's Kathy. So there's a famous Episcopal evangelist named John Guest, still alive today, and his comment was, there is no greater youth organizer for the Christian faith in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh area, than Kathy Christie. And there was a huge influx from that area. I talk in there about a kind of evangelical revival with the Jesus movement in Pittsburgh during those years. R.C. Sproul, John Gerstner, a part of that, and a lot of Reformed theology and things like that. So, but yeah, Tim would say, not only is she my wife, my partner in ministry, but she's the one who introduced me to Lewis, especially his fiction, Edwards, through his theology, and then on and on and on through Tolkien and others. So major influence. They did know each other in college as well, because Kathy's younger sister was at Bucknell with Tim, 2 years behind. So I interviewed her for the book as well.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things that you said, or somebody, I don't think it was you, maybe you're quoting in an interview, but someone said she functions like an editor in Tim's head. So when
that
he's
was Liz
preaching,
Kaufman who said that.
Okay,
to me.
when he's preaching, he can kind of hear her critique. So she wasn't always
well,
encouraging,
and I mean, she was the one afterward who would tell him all the things he was wrong about. Yeah. During the Q&A sessions, after the sermon for the early years of Redeemer, they actually modeled it after something they saw R.C. Sproul do called Gabfest. So they'd do Q&As. If Kathy didn't like Tim's answer, she'd start correcting him, and she'd pipe up from the front row, start answering those questions as well. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting dynamic.
Okay, so one other story that was in there that was, again, just amazing.
And she was a book publisher, by the way.
Yes,
in Philadelphia,
she was a real editor.
She worked as a book publisher.
And they've co-written some books together, so you may know that as well. Yeah. So 9/11. Post 9/11, that sermon, New York City being downtown, significant moment in his own life and ministry. But there's a Kathy Keller story to that day too that was also just just a fun one to share.
You know, Kathy, and if you watch the memorial, you could see this come out as well. Kathy has always been no publicity. No publicity. It's one of her major ministry rules. And it wasn't always followed. It was hard to kind of hide from the press in New York City what was happening. But there were a number of Christian media outlets like CBN that came for that service, and she physically chased them away. Yeah. It was like, you are not going to broadcast from here. She was also fiercely protective of the church's local identity and its mission to New York. So she was a lot of that conscience with Tim that also just kept him anchored in that congregation instead of becoming sort of the free-floating evangelical superstar that he certainly was in some ways, but could have become a lot more.
Yeah. So who's going to write the Kathy Keller biography? Is that one coming soon? Is that on your list?
Somebody with a lot. Yeah.
We're live streaming this, so if you say it, everybody hears.
It's a wonderful project for somebody to undertake. She is a fascinating figure, and I think maybe the best tribute to writing a book about Tim would be helping people to see Kathy's role, because it's interesting, in that same interview where he said, I'm not fighting cancer, I'm fighting my sin, he says, the only thing I'm going to miss here is Kathy. She's the only thing I'm going to miss.
Yeah,
just a uniquely close relationship. And I was talking to you about this earlier, but whenever you were talking to Tim on the phone, you were always talking to Kathy. Well, Kathy in the background. And she's written a number of things. You can find it at the Gospel Coalition. She wrote one thing in particular about why to not marry an unbeliever. It comes from her ministry experience in New York of always the same. And we had a friend in New York who was in that situation, engaged to a non-Christian, and actually went to Kathy and told her about the situation. And she said, I'll write this article for you with everything that I always tell women who come to me. About why it'll never work and don't do it. So she wrote that article for us, one of our most popular all-time articles.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Why you should not marry an unbeliever.
Okay, one more question biography-wise. So I would actually love to do C.S. Lewis or Edwards or some of those people that are significant influences. There's chapters you can read on more of that. But there was a group called the Dogwood Fellowship that was, we tell people here all the time, be in a small group, don't do life alone, have conversation partners, read stuff together, argue it out, figure it out. What was the Dogwood Fellowship, and what role did that play in his thinking, and what contribution came out of that?
The Dogwood Fellowship became my inspiration for starting the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. The idea there is that given the rapidly changing, transforming culture, we need to bring people together in an interdisciplinary fashion. We've got to bring together pastors with professors with marketplace leaders. That was based off an invitation that Tim received in the 2000s. It was from one of the nation's leading sociologists, a scholar named James Davison Hunter. He's actually he's been famous for a long time, but he invented the phrase culture war. So if you've heard of culture war, which I think we all have, that was his phrase, going back to the 1990s. Anyway, so he brought together so he's a scholar, two pastors, two business leaders, brought them together for some deep reading in social criticism. Just briefly, when I met with Hunter, I think it was 2016, I was asking him a number of political questions. His response to me was, I'm not sure why you're treating me like I, read the weather on TV. I'm a climatologist. I talk about what's been happening for years, decades, generations. I'm not talking about it whether it's going to be cloudy tomorrow. That was how he was interpreting my questions about politics. So almost all of Tim's major contributions from the mid-2000s of all kinds of different deep social criticism was developed off that fellowship meeting, those fellowship meetings based on their shared sort of history in Virginia, that's the Dogwood part, with that interdisciplinary group. And that was a group that just challenged him to read more deeply. And again, the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, where we continue to do that kind of work through what we publish and then also what we bring together for collaboration, kind of continues that legacy.
So a little more, or one example, like who's a thinker or what's an idea or something, because they may show up in sermons and people may not know, I heard this, I've heard him say this multiple times or quote this person. I didn't realize it came from that discussion group.
So from the Dogwood Fellowship you're talking about there? The major, Charles Taylor is a sociologist and basically has written the definitive account of secularism in Western culture. Everything about Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age, going back to 2008, his magnum opus is from that group. And so it's interesting, if anybody's known Tim for the last 15 years, they just automatically think that he was always doing this kind of work, but he really wasn't until that time. So if you ever hear anybody talking about Charles Taylor, which I've published some books on him and things like that, that's from that group. that's where that emerged from that group. Or another example would be the book To Change the World. If you ever hear somebody talk about faithful presence, that was another phrase that was coined by James Davison Hunter in dialogue with that group. So very influential.
Yeah, those are good. If you want to read Charles Taylor and try to read the big one, good luck.
Don't try that
If you
one.
want to try one that's understandable, Collin has edited a book. What's the name of the book? I should know
Our
this.
Secular Age, 10 Years of Reading and Applying Charles Taylor. So go ahead and check that out.
Yeah,
Our
that's right.
Secular Age.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't bother with the big one.
It's like a
Sorry to say.
translation. It's in English, actually. So it's a
Instead
good.
of academic speak. That's
Yeah,
true.
that's right. It's a good way to talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's shift to discipleship, church, ministry. Some of these questions. So I've heard Eugene Peterson and other people say this. Most pastors have one sermon. It's sort of just in them, and it sneaks out in every sermon that they preach. You mentioned a sermon earlier. Maybe this is his. Is Tim Keller a one-sermon guy? Is he a multiple sermon guy? What would you say is kind of the driver when it comes to the way he thinks?
That's a great question. Certainly you would say, as somebody who was charged with rightly dividing the word of truth from Genesis to Revelation, you'd say that he had many different sermons in him. But if you woke him up in the middle of the night and said, you've got to preach right now, he'd be going to the prodigal son text right there. I mean, I will say though that that series and that book really changed my life in a lot of different ways. I'm an older brother and I have a lot of those type A tendencies. And so that book was just really encouraging to me. However, I think my favorite story and a preferred sermon is his sermon, The Girl Nobody Wanted, which I think I discovered in this book was a wedding sermon. He preached The Girl Nobody Wanted at a wedding about Rachel and Leah. And so if you woke me up in the middle of the night, I would probably teach, largely under Tim's influence, an Old Testament narrative. I thought he always did such a good job of drawing the gospel out of those. So pulling that from Genesis is actually just met the woman who was in that wedding. It was during a church service. They actually had a wedding during the church service. Only one they ever did, preached that message. But if people went out here and listened to The Girl Nobody Wanted about Leah and fulfillment in Christ, man, that'd be a good outcome from this meeting if you go listen to that.
Yeah.
Girl Nobody Wanted.
I mean, I can actually remember where I was the first time I listened to the Prodigal God sermon.
Yeah.
I listened to it and I was like, is this right? Is he right about this? I listened to it again and I thought, oh my gosh, this is like, he just is nailing me.
When it seems...
I listened to it again and I was like, after the third time I called home, I went to my dad. I'm like, hey dad, I just listened to the sermon. This is what this guy said. Is he right? And I was like, I felt undone. I just felt like he just explained my life, and I'm much more sinful than I thought I was. Before I listened.
That was his only personal mentor in life was Ed Clowney, and that was largely Ed's interpretation there that he'd picked up through his theological tradition, but certainly became new for most of us, probably through Tim. And then Tim would always add a bunch of new dimensions to it and things like that, especially with a lot of insights toward the human heart. That's probably why it hit so many of us so hard. It's like, oh my, I've always been thinking about a warning against running away from God. The whole warning of this passage is about the people who stay and think that they don't need God's grace because they do the right things. The sermon is about the Pharisees and it's about me.
Yeah. So here's another preaching question. And you use this phrase, it is that preaching should be, or the Christianity should be intellectually satisfying and get the phrase right. Existentially satisfying.
Existentially satisfying and intellectually
credible.
Credible.
That's the phrase.
Yeah. Yeah, so go ahead.
Yes, so that is true. And it seems like when you hear, anytime you listen to a Tim Keller sermon, it's going to be intellectually credible. It seems like he's done his homework. It's right. But there's something, it's not just information. It's like somewhere, at some point, your heart begins to get engaged. And I've heard people describe that. So is there something about his preaching that's unique, or what's happening with that?
There's two things there. Part of that's simply rhetorical. So he would say that if he looked out on this group and you weren't taking notes at the beginning, he was doing something wrong. And then he would say if you were still taking notes at the end, he was doing something wrong. The beginning, he wanted to give you a lot of information, and in the end, he wanted to engage your heart, want to gauge your emotions. And that was one of the things he talked about being distinct about preaching. You're really trying to evoke a certain worshipful feeling there, and ultimately also then action as well. But I would say it's also, one thing people often get confused by is they look at the beginning of the sermon and they think, oh, this guy's so insightful because he quotes the New York Times, he reads so widely in here. That wasn't really, that was sort of like the teaser, the ultimate, kind of the main course was his experience as a counselor, his experience in his own soul, his introspection, his experience just talking to people and hearing from them as a pastor. He was very much influenced by CCEF and their work on biblical counseling. You could go read his longtime friend David Pallison's work on the idols of the heart and Vanity Fair. That would be another positive outcome of this meeting if people went and listened and read that. So he really believed that preaching is about, yes, reaching the head, but ultimately reaching the heart and evoking that sort of feel. And so that's hard to do. It's really hard to do if, as a preacher, you're not engaged that way with the text, with God's word, with the Holy Spirit yourself. That's hard work to be able to do that. But I think that's a lot of what comes across, a kind of the old classic preacher term, just unction.
Yeah, unction.
And
that's
empowerment
right.
of the Spirit.
So talk about, the role of prayer. That's, Tim Keller. What did you learn about Keller's prayer life? He wrote a book on this, obviously, but what did you learn about him
I think that's
personally?
probably, there are probably many valid criticism of my book, but I think probably the most valid criticism of my book was underselling the role of prayer. I'm not really sure how I didn't come across it, because again, I was looking at the influences on him and I couldn't identify some person or some event that had really influenced him in prayer. So even to this day, I can't really tell you exactly where it comes from, but they're very much right. I think one of my favorite stories of Tim, and I even was thinking about this, lying in bed, getting ready to take an early flight this morning with my wife, and I just asked if I could pray for her, and that came from Tim and Kathy. It was in that post 9/11 period, and Kathy's Crohn's disease was really a struggle. Tim had thyroid cancer at the time as well. And they were like, if a doctor told you that you had to take this pill every day or you would die, you would take the pill. Well, what if we told you that your spiritual life and your marriage will not survive unless you pray together every day? Would you do it? And they said, well, of course we would. And then for the rest of their lives, they prayed together every day. So, I think maybe I didn't tell that story because it's in Meaning of Marriage. But that's something that's just very tangibly stuck with me. The importance of prayer. It's not an optional add-on. It's the core.
Yeah, 100%. I remember hearing that story. This week, I've thought about that story twice because for whatever reason, we were going to bed. Julie and I had not prayed, maybe didn't want to pray, didn't even want to talk to each other.
You don't ever regret praying.
Kathy
afterward.
Keller came to my head, and I thought, I got to take the pill or I'm going to die.
Yeah, I got to take the pill. That's a good thing. It's like going to church. You don't always feel like you want to go to church, but you're always glad you did.
Yeah.
Prayer is just, it's not everything is about our feelings. It's about just doing the disciplines and letting those disciplines orient your feelings the way they're supposed to work. So that's why we call them spiritual disciplines.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned this. Tim Keller was 57 years old when he finally wrote. He'd published his D-Man, right?
He did, yeah. Ministry of Mercy, yeah.
But he waited. Why did he wait so long? And what?
Well, really,
more about that, because that seems like a discipleship decision. He had all this stuff before, or what's happening in his life to?
Yeah, he had a whole mountain of published work. I think he's already working a ton of hours. Where is he supposed to find more time? This is in that 9/11, post 9/11 period. He's getting a lot of attention because of that. Keep in mind, he preached the 5-year anniversary sermon with President Bush in attendance and all the families at the 9/11 site, 5-year anniversary. So he's pretty well known by that time in 2006, which is before the books come out. He's in Christianity Today. Andy Crouch is writing about him, things like that. But really, it's more than anything else. I wish I could say there was a deliberate strategy behind it. There might have been. But more than anything else, it was because he lived in New York and a major New York publisher, he got connected via one of his members of his church, and they approached him. And that's part of what's been very different about Tim is I publish with Christian publishers. Most people publish with Christian publishers. One of the few Christian authors who was publishing in a mainstream press. And I think there were a lot of advantages to that, maybe some disadvantages as well, but a lot of that was just based in New York and the opportunity, and I don't know. I mean, he never did explain to me. I probably could ask Kathy and find out if there was a deliberate strategy, but I mean, there's still all kinds of things that he's written that are not published as well, so hopefully we'll see more of that in the future too.
So was there a book project he was hoping to do that we're not going to see happen?
Yeah. Look, it's all in the Lord's providence, so I'm not going to try to, be upset at the Lord about this. But in fact, his publisher was not interested in a book that he wanted to write about identity. So in a previous generation, he identified idolatry as the way of trying to explain to a culture that we're putting too much pressure on things that are not ultimate. Only God can handle that ultimate love and worship. When we're worshiping money, we're worshiping our careers, our family, those sorts of things. That was idolatry. That was a way of explaining sin to a generation that had lost a concept of guilt, okay? He believed that the major challenge in the 21st century was identity. Now, he did talk about this in his 2016 book, Preaching. You can see his illustration that he came up with on the spot in Oxford. And it was about the Anglo-Saxon warrior related to homosexuality. But his basic point was, we're not going to be able to communicate the beauty and the truth of the biblical sexual ethic simply by reinforcing to people that the Bible is true. We have to get underneath it to talk about the concept of identity that undergirds the entire Western individualistic project. And so the charge that he gave us at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics was, I need you guys to work this out. I'm not going to be able to write that book. I need you to work this out. And so even today, that's one of the things that I was working on was, how do we help people navigate this overwhelming sense of the search for identity apart from any outside influences except that which comes up from the self? How do we help to expose ultimately the lie of that, but with speaking the language that people understand, which is the inveterate search for identity? So that's the book that I really wish he could have written, but just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. So one other question for you. One of the emphasis of the church was their vocational training,
Absolutely.
Their connection of faith and work. That's something that we've been doing here as well. We've kind of copied the Gotham program and did a fellows program last year here.
That's great.
So, but why was that important? And is that just important in places like New York City, or what's happening with his emphasis on vocation and Christianity?
It did come in some sense. I think Tim's Reformed theology guided him both positively and negatively here. It guided him positively to say, everything is the Lord's. Everything we do is unto the Lord. This is neo-Calvinism. I talk about it in my book quite a bit. Abraham Kuyper, Herman Bavinck. Everything belongs to the Lord. He is sovereign over all things, not just what happens in these church walls. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that, but you can do a lot of harm in your work to your neighbor, to our society, and ultimately to yourself in idolatry. So when you're in New York City, you are dealing with a lot of people who are at the extreme end of their work. Meaning we're talking about the people making the most money, the people who are working the longest hours, the people who have invested the most in their career. And keep in mind, this is one of the unique dynamics of Tim. His church was not just a bunch of Wall Street bankers. It was also a bunch of artists, talking ballet dancers, Broadway actors and actresses, visual artists, all sorts of people like that. They were all in that church together, but what they tended to share was this common sense that I came to New York because if you make it here, you can make it anywhere. And if I can't make it here, I'm going to be crushed. My life is over. So that point of discipleship, but also evangelism, tended to come with vocational crisis. So yes, that was particular to New York, but I would imagine some things translate to the North Shore of Chicago there. But again, it was both positive and negative. The positive of the gospel is for all of life, but the negative of, but nothing is worthy of your worship other than God alone.
Yeah. All right. Okay, a few more questions here. I'm moving to the legacy kind of at the end of his life. One of the things that was, I think this was true, or from my observation seemed true regularly, and that was that Tim Keller seemed to be appreciated by people politically on the right and politically on the left. He seemed to be appreciated by people theologically in various different camps. It's not easy to draw the right and left line there, but just from lots of different perspectives, people seemed to have, he had not been canceled in the way that other people had. But
people tried, but yeah.
Definitely he was canceled by some, but not wholesale the way others had. But this was really obvious when the day that his death was announced, is that tribute after tribute. I mean, for that 48 hours, the amount of people on like social media places, but also like national publications that wanted to say something about what he meant to them. So, I mean, what was unique about the way that he conducted his life or his teaching or ministry that allowed him to kind of stand above that tribalism, that specific challenge?
Well, a simple answer is integrity and consistency. We've been through a pretty harrowing last decade in a lot of different ways. And he was the same person preaching the same message with the same widespread trust that was built through the way he treated people. So there are all sorts of different, one of the things that you heard at that time, it's like one of Tim's good friends is David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, and he talks about the differences between resume virtues and eulogy virtues. Resume virtues, the things that you accomplish in life to be able to rise the corporate ladder. Eulogy virtues, the things that people talk about with you at the end of your life. And it's pretty rare that people will eulogize you by, your obituary might include a lot of those accomplishments, but that's not usually your eulogy. And so it's just interesting that people's instinct was to eulogize not the person who accomplished all these things, but the person who had picked up the phone and talked to them, who had prayed for them, who had intervened during a difficult time in their life, or had given them their wisdom and things like that. And that was from people who, a lot of these stories are not public, and I'm not going to share them, but people who disagreed with him really strongly, younger people especially, who were building their legacy on repudiating the things that he stood for. That he would pick them up on the phone, pick up the phone and call them and talk with them and even argue with them. But there was a respect for them. There wasn't just this sense of, we're not the same tribe, therefore I have nothing to do with you. He believed that there was, look, this is a guy who was so optimistic that he thought he could help Twitter. I mean, I was like, Tim, I'm sorry, man, I don't think that's gonna work. But he said, I really think I can show how to do this. Like, I think this is gonna be okay. And he tried, and people didn't like it, but in part there's an earnestness. Like, we live in such a cynical time. And in some ways, he didn't fit our cynical time because he remained deeply earnest. And that had a way of disarming some people, while at the same time, it had a way of absolutely frustrating a lot of other people who thought, look, man, get with the times. We got to get stuff done. And there's no time for us to be able to be so careful. Like, we've got to activate here. So I think that's why a lot of people did not like him, but I think it's another reason why people across the spectrum respected him even when they disagreed.
Yeah. So if you're trying to look out 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever it is, and you are thinking about his legacy, obviously this book was looking backwards at his life, but I'm asking the forward-looking question. So you're a historian by training. So Northwestern, you did history. At TEDS, you did history. You've written books on revival and movement. Yeah. That's kind of been a part of was what Keller was doing, was God doing something unique in New York? Was this a movement? How do you think we're going to look back and kind of see what happened? What's your guess here?
Yeah, so my first book project I ever worked on was called The Leadership Secrets of Billy Graham. I was working at Christianity Today at the time. And so it's been really fun for me bookending my career so far, starting with Billy Graham, moving to Tim Keller. Interestingly, both of them are famous largely for New York. Billy Graham's most famous crusade was New York City in 1957, of course, where Tim made it. That's a long history of evangelists in through the 19th century. People don't remember the 19th century capital of evangelicalism, which at one point was dominant around 1860. Biggest revival in American history, 1857-58 in New York. New York was the Protestant and evangelical capital of the country. So very similar in that sense, but very different, and very different that Billy Graham cultivated publicity to be able to translate it into evangelism. Tim shunned publicity. Look, they're very different personalities. That's part of the difference there. I do think that Tim, in some ways, will have more of a legacy because so much of what we remember from figures in the past is what we can appropriate for them, which is their writings. So he left a lot of writings, but they weren't really his strength. But I do think that one thing that's common between both of them, and this was the major argument that my colleagues Harold Myra and Marshall Shelley were trying to get at, is that what Billy did was actually he left an institutional legacy. And that's really out of, places like Christianity Today and Gordon Conwell and a number of others, but that's really out of step with a lot of our values today. We're not building institutions, but that was Tim. Tim built institutions. He built the Gospel Coalition. He built Redeemer City to City. He built Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And so a lot of the legacy will be tied up in, and he and I talked about this at the end of his life, a lot of his legacy will be tied up in those institutions and how they steward that influence over the years. Because if they veer off in wildly different directions or if they disappear without him, something like that, well, that'll affect his legacy. But it's that combination. It's the sermons that people still listen to. It's the books. And we could be looking at a figure who's remembered the way we remembered J.I. Packer, John Stott, which would be really wonderful. But there's also the possibility we remember him just in my very amateur historical perspective. It seems as though every 100 years or so roughly, there's somebody who brings together a combination of being modern and orthodox. And when you talk about Tim's particular proclivity, and kind of who he was at his core, it was bringing together the modern with the orthodox. And if you look back on it, that was John Calvin in the 16th century. That was Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century. It was Herman Bavinck in the 19th and early 20th century. And so you always see somebody who synthesizes these things, who says we can be orthodox even in a changing world. And that was the case. And all of them with strong cosmopolitan orientations, attending to the ideas of the world. So I think there's a possibility we see something like that. But that's for people who are not as close to the time and the person as I was. So that's why I wrote my book, and now I get to see all people write their own versions and probably disagree with me quite a bit. That's fine, that's what it's for.
Yeah. All right, so we're talking, positively and in a lot of ways indebted to Tim Keller's legacy and sacrifice and writings and the way God's used him. This is not a hagiography. This is not a venerate Tim Keller type of book.
Well, you could just read the book. Yeah, it's not that way at all. Yeah.
Yeah. So you are fair. There are places where you're criticizing him, but the last chapter on the rings of the tree, the illustration you used earlier. Yeah. So I want to let you speak to the people who are in the room or those who are watching. Yeah. Maybe people can do their own exercise, write their own book in their head of the ways that God has worked in their own life or seen their spiritual and intellectual formation happen. Is there an exercise? Is there you teach students at Beeson, how do you help people kind of do this for themselves and see what God's been working in their own life?
Well, bear with me for a second on this one. I promise it does work, but it requires a little bit of explanation for it. One of the key concepts that Tim helped to introduce to others is something called disenculturation. If any of you have seen the recent movie about the Jesus movement, and some of you may have even participated in that in the 1960s and 1970s, but there was a major kind of crisis at that time, and that was, do all of these young people have to conform to the traditional church to be followers of Jesus? Do they have to wear certain clothes, like certain amount of music, have certain kind of hair colors, things like that? Richard Lovelace was one of Tim Keller's professors at Gordon Conwell. He was the key figure saying, theologically, biblically, culturally, no. Because the Lord works through all kinds of different cultural expressions with the same biblical theology. Okay. So he's saying, in fact, culture can sometimes inhibit the spread of the work of the Spirit by forcing everybody into molds that they don't fit. Okay. So what I do with my students is I ask them to write a 1,000-word statement, a personal narrative of disenculturation. And I just give them 3 points. I say, here's the first one. Write about things that if you were a missionary or a teacher or a parent, we all do this if you're a parent, things that you believe in, that you've inherited from your past, that you think everybody needs to do. This is not just true for me, this is true for everyone. I'm gonna pass this along. That's number one. Number two, what are those things in my life that they're important to me, but if my kids or somebody is in a mission field or in my church, if they don't care about those things, it's okay. It would be wrong of me to impose my preferences on another person. Then the third thing you do is then you write about, is there anything that I've inherited or that I've imbibed or whatever that is definitely wrong, and I really want to never pass that along to anybody else. This is a way of being able to see yourself and the cultural situation that you're in so that you can teach others with some sort of critical distance from it. But you can look back yourself and understand yourself much more. The students in my class, they don't understand what I'm doing at all at first, and then they go through the exercise and they've just never thought that way. They've never seen themselves the way other people might see them, which you have to do as a missionary in a different culture, right? I mean, we would all instinctively do that, but so many of us are in the same culture. By the way, this is what happens to you when you move from the Midwest to the South, or from the South to the Midwest. You have to understand yourself the way others see you. Like, oh, not everybody speaks this way or says this thing. Like, you have to understand yourself that way. So that's something that can help you to see how the Lord has kind of developed a core in your life and then developed these rings. But it comes through a process of dynamic interchange. What are things I want to keep? What are things I can drop? What are things I have to drop and I have to change? Again, another way of describing this is simply parenting. Yeah. Because you have to do that usually with a spouse who didn't share all the same assumptions. You have to navigate that. But missionaries have to do this. I think we would all benefit from doing that ourselves, even just in our personal lives.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Join me in thanking Collin one more time. Thanks for being here, sir. We do have desserts for you outside. So there are desserts. There's some coffee out there. There are books. He is going to go to the book table there, and if you want to talk to him over at the book table, be there. If you want the book signed, welcome to do that as well. Thank you for being here. We're really thankful. Talk to somebody around you if you don't know him, and have a good evening.